Uh, Windows and doors are probably one of the most common things that people think of. And without being kind of facetious about it, I think part of it is because you see them. And I know it maybe sounds silly, but if you're living on a road with 20 houses and your neighbor gets brand new windows, everybody on the road knows they've got brand new windows. You don't necessarily know that they've got, they're loft insulated. And sometimes, I'm not saying you shouldn't get new windows necessarily, but sometimes the advantage of brand new, top of the range double glazed windows is not as significant as you might think. And I would often, encourage people to look at, part of the service we provide is looking at the relative pros and cons of different options. And new windows might be appropriate once you've already, looked at, as I said, loft insulation or wall insulation, or in combination with these things. But again, I have very often gone to houses that have triple glazed windows, super insulated, laminated front doors, and a tiny scrap of loft insulation that's been left there since they were first built. The other thing that doesn't, you're not improving the efficiency of your heating system necessarily, but the actual controls. So if you've got an older heating system, sometimes things like appropriately using thermostats, thermostatic radiator valves, etc., can help you just use the heating as and when it's required and not be, using additional energy when it's not required. Renewable heating. The most common, I would say now, heating system that people are looking at in Argyll and Bute must surely be air source heat pumps. I think probably everyone will have seen air source heat pumps now. It's hard to find interesting photographs for a discussion like this, or graphics, but basically air source heat pump looks a bit like a air conditioning unit. It's a box with a fan in it. And in a lot of houses, an air source heat pump will work excellently. They, rather than heating the house directly with electricity, as most of you probably know, you gather the energy, the heat that's available from the outside environment, and concentrate it. Basically, similar to the reverse action of a fridge, and use that to heat the home. And so where your storage heater, you might put in 1 unit of electricity and get 1 unit of heat out. With the air source heat pump, for that 1 unit of electricity, you might get 3 or 3.5 units, or possibly even better in some cases, of heat. So it's a dramatic reduction in the energy required. Something that you may have spoken about before. It's with electricity, I suppose, there's reducing the electricity, but there's also the question, I suppose, where the electricity comes from. If the electricity heating your home, if all of our electricity came from renewable resources, then the impact on the environment would be, relatively low. If our electricity comes from burning coal and gas, or importing it from other countries and potentially burning coal and gas, then the carbon emissions associated with an electric heating system could be high. Ground source heat pumps or water source heat pumps obviously are similar, but rather than gathering the energy from the air, it's from the ground or water, like a lake or a pond. The advantage of those is that they are a bit more stable. Obviously, the heat temperature of the air outside fluctuates, more dramatically. The big thing with heat pumps is the suitability for your house. So if you have a modest-sized, relatively well-insulated house, there's a good chance that an air source heat pump could be appropriate. If you have a, kind of baronial mansion with, solid stone walls, it's unlikely in a lot of cases that a heat pump will be appropriate. There are, different setups to suit different houses, and potentially in bigger houses you could have a series of heat pumps linked together, but it gets kind of complicated and expensive. So an alternative option, which was more popular 5 or 10 years ago, is biomass. And biomass, which is basically the burning of logs or wood pellets, or in bigger systems, wood chips, can provide the heat required to heat larger properties or less well insulated properties. And if the fuel comes from, if the wood comes from the local area, it can be it's the carbon footprint of it, the carbon emissions can be very low, and that's a real positive. And if, like me, you spend half your life cutting and chopping and stacking logs and then loading them manually into your boiler, it can be a very cheap way of heating your house. Obviously, in an urban built-up area, you can have other questions regarding air quality. Now, most of these biomass boilers, they should have they should have low emissions, but their suitability will depend on this kind of site specifics, I think, more and more now. There's also solar hot water. It's fairly straightforward. Solar panels for heating hot water. In Scotland, obviously, in the wintertime, their impact is going to be low, but in the most time from kind of Easter till Halloween, you should be getting a reasonable amount of your domestic hot water from solar hot water system. Possibly one of these things that, if you've got everything else sorted out already, you've got a well insulated house, a renewable heating system, you're minimizing your energy consumption, that could be the cherry on the top of the cake. But again, maybe not something to look at before addressing the really obvious things like your loft insulation. A very hot topic at the moment is renewable electricity. Understandably, people are seeing big increases in the cost of electricity, their energy bills coming in, and they're looking at basically trying to produce their own electricity to mitigate some of the increases in cost, or possibly to address some concerns regarding carbon emissions, climate change. Perhaps this is something, I don't know if people in the group have done this or are looking at it, or it has been discussed, so I'd be quite happy to discuss it more. In most cases, I would say that solar PV, that's photovoltaic panels, is the option that's likely to be realistic. Micro wind and micro hydro, while not impossible, in many cases that I have looked at in my experience, are not very viable. I have been to a house with a micro hydro system, but the guy who ran it, really knew his stuff, was very enthusiastic, and he had everything set up perfectly to work on this system. Most of us won't have a river with enough of a fall or a head of water running through our garden in order to be able to power a house with a micro hydro scheme, and it's not going to kind of solve all of our problems. But in site specific cases, perhaps. And there's also a question, basically, you generate all this electricity, and what do you do with it? If you're at home in the daytime and the sun is shining and you're producing electricity, and you can turn on the washing machine and whatever it is to boil a kettle and use the electricity as it's being produced, that's ideal. There would be cases, obviously, people are away or out at work or whatever, and it can be attractive to look at energy storage, battery systems, and there may well be cases, there probably are cases where this will work well. What I often encourage people to look at basically to do a cost benefit analysis of a battery system, including looking at the lifespan of the battery system. In some cases, it's possible that you would never, the cost of the battery wouldn't be outweighed by the savings made by it within its lifespan. Now that may vary, and there are possibly also environmental considerations in terms of the energy expended and the minerals extracted to produce these batteries, to manufacture them, and possibly to deal with them when they come to the end of their lifespan. Again, if people have any personal experience or thoughts or expertise in that, I think it could be a point for discussion. Now, one of the major issues that people come across if you're trying to improve energy efficiency or reduce your carbon emissions, you're looking at renewable heating systems, etc., is cost. There's no question that like an air source heat pump is going to be expensive, or doing a kind of deep retrofit on your house, insulating the walls, underfloor, loft, etc., is going to be expensive. So there are a number of incentives to try and help people on this journey and encourage people to improve the situation. I'll look at the Home Energy Scotland loan and cashback, the private sector landlord loan. The HEAPSABS grant is basically there's an insulation grant scheme which is administered by Argyll and Bute Council that we can refer people for, and Warmer Homes Scotland, which is a grant scheme that some people could potentially be eligible for. So the Home Energy Scotland loan, basically there's interest-free loans available for energy efficiency measures and renewable technologies. So that's things like insulation, solar PV, air source heat pumps, etc. There's cashback of up to 40% available for some energy efficiency measures. And what cashback means, because when I first heard it, it sounded like a bit of something that, some dodgy marketing thing. Essentially, a certain percentage of your loan, you don't have to pay it back. So it's not a grant, it's not called a grant, but it's quite similar to a grant in, in terms of its impact on your budget. There's cashback of up to 75% for certain renewable heating systems. Now that's capped at a certain level. So to give you an example, if you wanted to get an air source heat pump, and I can't give you a quote for anyone's individual house, but imagine it was going to be £12,000 for the air source heat pump and hot water cylinder, radiators, and all the labour. You could get a loan of £10,000 from Home Energy Scotland, of which £7,500 was cash back. So you're only paying back the 2,500, and you're potentially, covering the balance of the cost of the system from, your own funds or from a separate loan or whatever the case may be. So it is it's a good incentive. It makes it much more viable for a lot of people to look at these options. Whereas, if you're looking at £12,000 all out of your own pocket, that might not be an option. A private sector landlord loan, very straightforward. If you are a private sector landlord and you meet certain criteria in terms of being appropriately registered with the council, etc., there are interest-free loans available for energy efficiency or renewable technologies to improve the standards of your property.